when I do that, like the hairs on the back of my neck stand up and I get like these chills. When I started in fraud fighters were typically ex-policemen. Let me go way back to before you were born and tell you what it was like. Well, 30 years ago, that's exactly how I started, right? I absolutely hated it. I really hated it until it's too late for a company, right?
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the new episode of the podcast A Journey into Fraud Prevention. I'm your host Ivan, and today is our last episode of the first season. I believe I shouldn't present our guest because he is well known in the industry. Our guest today is Frank McKenna. We begin our episode. Поехали! Hi everyone, hi Frank. Thank you for joining us today. I have a lot of questions, and usually I'm starting all my episodes with the same question. Probably short one, but I don't believe it's going to be short based on your experience. Fraud prevention. What is fraud prevention for you?
Oh yeah. Well, it's great to be here. I love, talking about fraud and fraud prevention is, to me, when I describe fraud prevention, I really describe it in kind of the structure of a fraud department, like I'm used to. Fraud prevention is one of three pillars, one of three activities that most companies, how they organize around fraud. So there's fraud prevention, there's fraud detection, and then there's fraud recovery. And fraud prevention is the very, very first set of activities that a company is going to do to stop fraudsters from getting in the door. If the fraudster gets in the door, then they're going to use fraud detection, so software and processes to stop the fraud as soon as it gets in the door. And if, unfortunately, the fraudsters are able to commit the fraud and steal money, then that's fraud recovery. So fraud prevention for me, it basically means doing everything you can from a people and a process and a technology perspective to keep the fraudsters away. So if you're a company, whether you're a merchant or you're a card issuer or a bank, fraud prevention is all about making yourself the worst target for fraudsters that you can be. So that is meaning, what that means is that you're going to have really strong technology in place that's going to be something that fraudsters talk about. And they say, well, we're not going to go out and hit this bank because we know that we can never get any money from them. Fraud prevention to me, is all about the people, training people in the company. So when they recognize a fraud, whether it's a fraudster calling in or a fraudster logging in online, that they can recognize that and stop the fraudster before they get in the door. So that fraud prevention aspect is probably the most important piece of fraud. So for me, that what it means is putting a strong lock on the door. I guess you could say that's what it means to me.
Whoa, that's it's exactly aligned what I thought in general about all aspects of fraud prevention. I know it's different variation, and right now it's a plenty of different titles. Not all of them calling fraud prevention. Some of them calling trust and safety, but
Yeah, it's the same thing. Trust and safety is fraud prevention, right? It's everybody's kind of following the same path, and it's always the same thing. When you're going to set up a fraud function, it's always prevention is the very first thing. You got to get that right, or everything else fails.
I just feel that sometimes companies call it differently rather than fraud prevention, specifically in areas where they're still calling customers to not create this kind of effort on the customers when you say, hello, my name is Ivan, I'm from fraud prevention department. You already kind of try to create labels for the person that it might be something wrong, rather than you call,
Right.
I'm from trust and safety. So
That's right. So maybe it's a way not to alarm the customer. So you use another friendlier term that makes them feel like you're keeping them safe. That's actually a good point. I didn't even realize that, but that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. I checked your profile. You have been in fraud industry for more than 30 years, and you started when I born in 1990. What changed in the
Wow.
industry?
Oh my gosh. That's a good question. Man, what hasn't changed? So, yeah, let me go way back to before you were born and tell you what it was like. It was so simple back in 1990 when I started in fraud. I'm going to take credit card fraud, for example. That's credit card fraud is one of the oldest frauds out there. In the 1990s, credit cards were becoming really popular. And credit card fraud and check fraud, meaning when somebody wrote a check, those were pretty much the only two types of fraud that a fraud manager or a fraud analyst like me had to worry about. So I was really doing something very simple, which was just calling customers, verifying their credit card activity, and they would tell me yes or no. And it was so easy back then. And credit card fraud at that time was only a $2 billion a year problem globally. Now it's 15 times that level. It's 30 billion in credit card alone. So the fraud losses have increased 15 times from when I started. And that's just one type of fraud. When as you went into the, late 90s and early 2000s, people started to use the internet, so you started to have a lot more different frauds like digital, internet, online fraud, e-commerce, merchant fraud. So then you had basically about 5 times as many frauds that fraud managers had to deal with. And then when you go into 2010, 2015, everything went to like instant payments. So you had Zelle and you had Venmo and you had all these instant real-time payment platforms. And that just made the fraud manager's job even more complicated because they were dealing with, 10 or 15 new types of fraud. And then with crypto and with all of the scams that are going on now, it has become a mountain of fraud for the industry to handle. So what hasn't changed, I guess, is a better question. Pretty much everything. It's infinitely more complex. There's substantially more fraud, and there's a lot more technology that's being used to counter fraud. So it's been a complete change. I'm shocked at all the change in the last 30 years.
I believe you still remember manuals from Visa or MasterCard when they were, I don't know, 2 pages. Right now, it's 100.
Yes, that's just one example. And if you're just getting into fraud, it can seem a little overwhelming, and it is. But back in when I started, it was very simple. And like you said, it was very easy to understand. Now you have to be very technical. Now you have to really understand technology, people, psychology, how to communicate. It's an infinitely harder job.
But in general, what remains the same, it's actually fraud part. It's only growing. However, it stays stable. It's still there. It's not going anywhere. And it's no signs it's going to be um,
Oh
left.
no.
Yeah. So, no.
No, I think if you have you'll probably have a long career in fraud because you told me you liked it, and I think if you like fraud and you love doing it, you can have your whole career. That's what I've done. Um, I've never deviated from it, but you will find when you look back in 20 years, you may be on a podcast telling somebody, a young guy, the same thing like that. Wow, you should remember back in 2023 when we, 20, whatever you started, maybe 2015, it was so simple. Now it's like way more fraud.
Yeah. Looking forward to be on this podcast in the 20 years.
Yeah, I would love to hear that podcast and all the fraud that's going on in 20
Oh my
years.
God, I cannot really imagine it's gonna be, but yeah, already exciting. So we already know about fraud, but what about fraud fighters? How have fraud fighters changed over the years?
Oh, wow. So fraud fighters, when I started in fraud fighters were typically ex-policemen. It was very hard to get a job in fraud if you were right out of college like myself, because everybody that had the jobs were from police force, right? They were former investigators that got into banking. It was very hard to break in. And fraud fighters were very good at understanding the psychology of fraud and very good at investigating fraud after it happened. But fraud fighters today are very different. Fraud fighters are younger people. They're very technologically savvy. They're forward thinking. They are very comfortable around fast moving, changes and being dynamic. Fraud fighters have become much more, I would say, much more of a technical type of person, but also a person that has good communication skills. So it's gone from like being really investigative to almost being a semi, like I would say, almost a hacker yourself, right? Somebody that understands technology, moves quickly, and really fights the fraudsters toe to toe in their same technical ways.
Whoa. We had a recent chat with one of my friend who participated on the second episode that we right now have two different e-commerce areas, pre-COVID and post-COVID. It's changed a lot, changed the game for
Yeah.
e-commerce in general. But when you describe fraud fighters back there about like police investigator, and I don't believe someone right now who is working in police decide to join fraud. Maybe it's someone, I don't know, that anyone like that. But yeah, it is multiple generation already, I would say.
It's very generational. I did an article on fraud fighters through the years, and that's what I found is it's gone from very investigative to very technical. And I think it's just going further and further down that road. If you look at a lot of the new fraud companies that are being started by very young people in their 20s and 30s, the fraud companies are very technologically savvy, and these founders of these companies really are much more technical than the founders of fraud companies 10 or 15, 20 years ago, who are more, maybe traditional business people. It's become much more software oriented.
Got you. Yeah. And what's the hardest things when you work with fraud prevention, like in general, in that industry?
What's the
Yeah.
hardest things? The hardest thing to work in the fraud prevention industry is the communication side. A lot of times, and you kind of brought this up earlier, maybe when you talked about trust and safety versus fraud, is a lot of times if you work in fraud, fraud is considered like a negative word, and companies don't want to hear that word ever. So they want to, they want to use other terms that kind of water it down and make it less important. So in fraud, have always found myself needing to communicate the damage of fraud, whether it's to victims, to companies, to people within the companies, to the government, to everybody. I've always had to really communicate just how bad it is to get people to listen and do something about it. To me, what comes second nature to maybe you and to me isn't necessarily the way other people think. So you always have to communicate that. That's always the hardest part because a lot of people want to ignore fraud or they want to be blind to it because they don't want to think it happens. That's to me the hardest part. What about you?
Whoa. I believe I'm agree with you because when you try to describe or I know get some budget to improve something, you always try to show the possibilities if we are not in place what might cost to the company. I know simple attack or any issues to the growing business who became popular and valuable for the fraudsters, what this mean to the business. And most of the time everyone happy when it's not there, but when it's happened everyone start to look and say, oh, you didn't do what we expected. But when you ask it for a I know budget or extra person to help,
Mm.
it's never like a easy conversation.
You're right. Yeah. So that goes to the communication of the problem to people because you at your company may not experience it currently. So you have to bring in stories of other people that it's happened to or business experts outside the company to talk about it so that you can get that budget. But you're right. I mean, I think there's a reluctance to invest in fraud until it's too late for a company, right? They will invest in fraud once the problem's already happened. To get them to invest before is enormously hard. So I think you're right. I think you may have a better answer because I think getting the budget is actually the hardest thing that I found.
I have a dream position for myself. It's calling chief out of office. um, and you're supposed to be work only. I know, depends on the holiday policy in the company. However, I saw the person somewhere in LinkedIn who changed his title from fraud fighter to revenue protector. And I found this is
Oh,
lovely title. It's self-explaining. You can't argue with someone who say, I'm here to save your revenue. You can't say, oh, we
yeah.
don't have fraud. But everyone happy to hear a word revenue. You're like trigger word.
That's a really good strategy because a lot of times I have a fraud company, right? And we sell products, and a lot of times when we talk about saving money from fraud, people don't want to hear it. But when we talk about being able to automate and impact fewer of the good consumers by targeting the fraud better and letting the good customers go through, everybody wants to hear about that. So the way that you position fraud, whether it's revenue protector or grow your business safely, I think that's what people want to hear, not fraud, because it's a kind of a negative term and it implies you're just going to stop revenue for the company or not let the company engage in business the way that they want to.
I know you have a page that's calling frankonfraud.com, and I'm gonna leave this one in description to the episode. But what motivated you to create this page and posted it regularly, some articles and information about fraud?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Maybe it's the same drive you had to create this podcast, right? But I'll tell you my story. And I'd love to hear why you created this podcast. But I created the page because I had a lot of things to say, and when I was working for a company and I wanted to write an article for a company, they always wanted me to write the article so that I could sell their product and service, not because I wanted to just talk about fraud and inform people of trends, of issues, of things that I saw, of recommendations. It always had to be tied to that company's product line. So what I wanted to do was create a blog that was just what I wanted to say. I could write about any company, any topic, any fraud type. It had nothing to do with selling anything. It was just exchanging information. So that was the main reason. But also, I wanted to learn about fraud across the industry and across the world. And when I was forced into writing a lot about it, I kept learning more and more and more. So to me, it's a way of me staying on top of fraud and educating myself, but then educating other people as well. So I was really a desire to just kind of do that. And I've loved it. It can be quite challenging though to put so much time into it. But what about you? Why did you start this podcast? What was your driving
Um,
force?
it's not some like interesting story or when I speak with the people about in general their position and how they start working wherever they're working right now. So I found it quite interesting that for the fraud prevention, it is a path usually contains a story in most of the time. I know some of the guys who work
Yeah.
in software developers and they have cool story as well. But for this kind of career path, you have clear education, you study, you know what the languages you expected to learn, how to work in specific areas. However, fraud is something not everyone like expecting to work with. if you study accounting and you're right now working with fraud prevention, what drive you there? It's like not far away. It is different what you study and spend years of your life to be good of.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, it's accounting is yeah. I agree with you. I think with fraud, you don't necessarily. There's no college program for fraud, right? You kind of you kind of fall into it, right? It's something that when what did you start off in fraud yourself, or did you have a were you always in fraud when you graduated? Did you start working in fraud right away?
No, I'm not. I started in customer support, and
Yeah, me
yeah,
too.
and after that, after all this call from the customers who say I can't recognize charges, and just like what's going on here, how it's actually work, and start to explore a bit. And it was position opened, interim position in the fraud department to um, manual review. This is how I start.
They'll 30 years ago, that's exactly how I started, right? I was in customer service. My job started at 5 in the morning. So I had to go get my car and get there by like 4:30. And they put a headset on and I started answering calls on this credit card, so customer support line. And people were complaining about, not getting their bill or late payments. And all day long, people were complaining. And one day somebody called and they said, it was a fraudster calling pretending to be a woman, but it was a man, and he was trying to get into this lady's account. And I was a customer service rep, and I was like, I didn't know what to do. And I stood up and said, "What should I do? There's a man here saying he's a woman trying to get into this customer's account." And they said, "Transfer to the fraud department." And I was like, "The fraud department? Now that sounds like a job I want." And about a month later, there was a fraud position open. So just like you, I saw that and go, wow, that's the job I want. And I told them, I'll work for free. I just want the job. In 6 months, you can fire me, but you don't even have to pay me. I want this job so much. And that's how I think a lot of people get started. So we have a very similar path.
You have a crazy motivation behind it. If you say don't pay me, I'm happy to like start and learn something.
Yeah,
That's the
exactly.
same. And you briefly have touched this topic, but do you believe we need fraud institution or like special degree to be part of fraud prevention?
You really don't. It can't hurt, by the way. So if you want to go out and you want to get degrees that will help you, certainly getting a more technical degree in college can only help. Something in computer, information systems, anything, around the technical side can help you in fraud, but you don't have to have a degree to get a job in fraud. If you want to get special certifications, there are programs, certifications like the ACFE, Association of Certified Financial Examiners. That certification program is pretty extensive. If you get it, you're going to be in a network of lots of fraud professionals that are going to be able to help you get a job. But you don't need to have any special degree to get in fraud. I'm not sure if you had a special degree to get in fraud. I certainly didn't at all. I was like a liberal arts major. I had no experience in fraud. I just had a desire. I had a desire to help people, and that's how I got my job. If you want to get a job in fraud, I would recommend that you try to use some of your, if you're working in customer service, for example, that you just use some of your experience helping customers with fraud and put it in your resume so that people see some of those types of things in your resume. So getting a job in fraud is not hard if you go in from an entry level. It gets harder if you're trying to do it at a more senior level, but if from an entry level, it's actually fairly easy and simple.
Hmm. Can't be agree more with you because as one of our guests mentioned previously that it's very dynamic and changeable. Even if you learn something today, it's maybe not applicable tomorrow. So it's
That's right. Yeah. Fraud is changing day in and day out. So the type of person that's very flexible is going to love fraud, right? Because every day you go into work, there's going to be something you didn't expect. And maybe you get this too, but there's nothing like the thrill of finding a fraud that's happening and stopping it. There's no other feeling like it. When I do that, like the hairs on the back of my neck stand up and I get like these chills. And imagine having a career where you always get that little rush. That's why I love fraud. Is that unexpected piece and putting a puzzle together. So it's a lot of fun.
yeah, I know opposite cases when you look in some huge loss and your heart stops working for a second when you figure out
Yeah,
something
your
went
heart
wrong.
jumps. Yeah, it's like a little rush. And if you work in fraud, you may get 2 or 3 of those a day. No other career has that sort of dynamic feeling. And that's why when you get a career in fraud, you're very unlikely to change your job because you're going to realize how fun it is.
You as a like professional fraud fighter, have you ever been a victim of fraud?
Oh yeah, for sure. I've been a victim of fraud several times. In fact, when I was coming out of college, before I even got a job, I was a victim of rental fraud in here in California. A landlord, had told me to write her. She wasn't a landlord; she was a property manager, and I rented an apartment, and she had me write her checks every month for I think it was $1,500 a month, but the rent was really only about $700 a month. So I was paying her an extra $750, and she was sending the property manager the right rental amount. So I found that out much later, and she was eventually arrested. But I was a victim of right out of college, just several thousand in fraud. I was a victim of a scam during COVID. It was small, but I was still a victim of buying Lysol off the internet from a completely fraudulent website. And I have a lot of experience in fraud. I don't know how I fell victim to it, but it's just because you work in fraud doesn't mean you can't get scammed and defrauded. Everybody can be a victim. I certainly was. Have you ever been a victim, or have you ever experienced it like on a personal side?
I would say I have a story that's I told my father it's pretty hard to describe to him what's fraud prevention, but I told him multiple stories that someone can call you, ask you some details. It's never true. If someone call you from the bank, you can drop off a call and call back to the bank, and they transfer you to this person to prove that's exactly happened. And
Yeah.
my father told me that I know it's maybe 2 years ago. He called me. Something strange happens. I got push notification through my bank application, and
Oh
someone
no.
straight away called me and say, it's I I know head of security from specific bank, and we need this code to prove some transfer money. Likely, we were fortunate that it wasn't any money on this account. It was like really small amount, like $50. Just that's it. It was
No.
like old account, and my father even forgot that it still exists. And
Oh
he say,
no.
yeah, yeah, that's the code. And the money gone. He just like, what's going on here? He called me back and say, yeah, no, I just that it's I work in fraud. I told you so. Very often, never say any codes, never confirm anything via phone if you're not sure it's someone from the bank and you were fortunate that this was like small bank account. And the next day, I had call from exactly the same number, and I started to play like an actor. I just,
Okay.
yeah, sure, I have a code, but is it okay? I have just like $500,000 on this account. It's gonna be enough to protect me. Maybe I need to transfer some money. The guy was so exciting on another side. I just
I bet he
yeah, I just
was.
like start to play this game a bit. Say, yeah, I just like transferred recently, but if you keep waiting, I'm selling my house. It's gonna be more money, so probably we might need to wait until this money transfer to a safe account. And the guy told me, yeah, no worries, we can start from small transfer. Yeah, I took like 10 minutes of discussion after this. I just drop
Oh,
off.
that's good.
This was fun.
I like that. Do you like to watch those YouTube videos of the scam stoppers that do the same thing? They kind of rope them in, and then they gain access to their webcam, and they turn around on the scammers and actually show their webcams and get them arrested. There's a lot of those YouTubers out there that do that
I
now.
will have a look.
I
Yeah,
love to
I
watch
will have
that.
a look afterwards. Yeah, it looks
Yeah.
and sounds interesting.
Oh yeah.
So actually, I have the last question. It's like pretty short. I believe I already know answer, but I just want to make sure that's exactly what I'm expecting. If you're able to back in time and options to choose any other professions, are you still keep with fraud prevention or you jump on something else?
I would never ever choose anything else. I actually, to be honest, I did have other careers. I was a teacher. I was a Spanish teacher, believe it or not. I was taught for a year, and I absolutely hated it. I really hated it. And so then I got into banking, and I hated that too. When I got my fraud position, I knew right then and there I would never do any other thing. I loved it so much. And looking back, I would never change because the opportunities it gave me were so endless. I got to do a job I loved every day. I eventually got to travel the world. I was able to work as a fraud consultant here in the US. I spent 2 years in Canada, 3 years in the UK. I made trips to Australia, Japan. I went to Brazil, Mexico, all over the world, traveling and helping people stop fraud. And I met so many great people and I did so many great things. There's no way I'd ever do any other job. And I think most people that get into fraud have the exact same experience as me. So it's a great career.
Well, it's great to hear, and we definitely everyone in the fraud industry happy that we have you. And I believe you influence a lot of the people who just like reading your blog or have a chance to speak with you or watch of any of your presentations. We're everyone
Yeah.
happy that you in that position.
Oh yeah, to me, I love to meet all the people I meet off of doing that blog, and like you probably meet a lot of people with the podcast. It's just so. I'd recommend everybody is just reach out to other fraud fighters because you'll learn so much. I certainly do. So I really appreciate everybody that reaches out to me and a chance for me to meet them.
You give a lot of advices during this podcast, but maybe you can give last advice for someone who looking to start fraud as a fraud prevention specialist, or maybe for someone who I know doing like teaching someone this here that it's possible to escape and looking for these options.
Yeah, so I think my advice would be don't be afraid to take a leap of faith. You can even go backwards a little bit in your career. Maybe you'll make a little bit less money. But fraud is growing. There's going to be so many opportunities that if you take that leap of faith to get into that fraud position and you excel at it, when you look back in a year, 2 years, 3 years, you're going to be so much further along. Don't be afraid to make that leap of faith. And number two, my second piece of advice is reach out to people in the fraud prevention world who are, maybe more senior, people that have done it for a while, and ask them to mentor you. I have worked with people who've contacted me through LinkedIn and said, "Hey, I really want to get into fraud management." And I have worked and helped them. Maybe it takes a year or 2 years, but help them get into positions. In fact, I hired one. Some lady had called me. She really wanted to get into fraud, and we talked for a year, and she took all sorts of classes, and I eventually hired her. So don't be afraid to get a mentor that's in the industry that can help you and guide you to get that career. Those would be my two pieces of advice.
Frank, thank you so much for joining me today. It was a nice talk and hear your story and everything, how it's changed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to our
You're welcome. I really enjoyed it.
to our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and please visit Frank page. I'm gonna leave on the description to this podcast. I personally found it very interesting, and I always looking forward for new posts and waiting for some exciting. That's right, or some scary
Yeah,
story.
I try. There's always something exciting. Like you said, there's always a story behind every fraud. So that's what makes it exciting to write about.
Yeah, and please, everyone, don't forget to subscribe and follow this podcast and share with your friends. So I'm gonna say my favorite word at the end of the podcast. That's cut.